What's up, and welcome back to the Chris Gates Fitness Podcast. Thank you, as always, for joining me this week on the episode. And got another awesome listener question to dive into this week. In case you missed it a few episodes ago, relaunched the podcast earlier this month. Well, I guess not this month, in June, where the podcast now is just centered around answering listener or client questions. Done a lot of different podcast episodes over the years. We're in the 150s now at this point, and I've dug into just about as many topics as I could think of. So I'm getting a lot more joy out of just taking one individual question, hopping onto the podcast for 10, 15, 20 minutes, answering it, and hopefully providing you with a lot of value. Maybe it's a question that you've wondered about yourself as well. So the question we're going to dive into on today's episode is fasting worth it for fat loss? And just generally, should you do a fast? Should you do intermittent fasting? I cannot tell you how many times fasting comes up in conversations that I have on social media. I talk with parents every single day, whether it be in comments on my posts or in DMs on Instagram, where folks are saying, I'm thinking about doing fasting. I'm going to try fasting again. Oh, fasting worked for me before. I need to lose weight, so I'm going to do it again. It is so popular, which is amazing to me because it's been around for a while now. Like intermittent fasting probably got really popular 7 or 8 years ago, and it's still a thing. It's still something that people are gravitating to, and it's still something that people have a lot of questions about regarding, is it the right thing to do? Should you do fasting? Is it best for fat loss? Is it something that's going to help you make progress and then maintain it long term? So it's a loaded topic and a loaded question, and one that I'm excited to dive into on today's episode just to give you my take. My take is there's some bias in there, but there's also mostly a lot of unbiased, hey, here's what I've seen over 7+ years of coaching and how fasting tends to work for people. To be completely transparent, I have used fasting in the past too. When I've done it, I've seen good results. But what I have seen along the way is that fasting for me and for most people tends to be a dieting strategy that is just that. It's a dieting strategy. For a lot of people, it tends to be something that's not really sustainable long term, but it is something that can be effective in the short term. The challenge there is just to figure out, okay, if I'm only using this for the short term, what will I be doing after I stop fasting? And that's where we run into a lot of problems and people run into issues. So we're going to dive into all of that in today's episode, and I hope this one is really helpful and valuable for you. If it is, make sure that you are subscribed to the podcast. You can do that anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also upload video episodes of these podcast episodes to my YouTube channel, so just search for Chris Gates Fitness or go to youtube.com/Chris Gates Fitness, and you can find me there. And then on my website, chrisgatesfitness.com, I have a podcast page that has links to everywhere you could possibly find this podcast. And if you ever have questions that you want me to answer in a future episode, feel free to send them my way. You can find me anywhere. You could leave a question as a review on wherever you are listening or watching. You could hit me up on literally any social media platform because I'm on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, or X. I still have trouble calling it X. I'm on Blue Sky now. What am I left out? TikTok, LinkedIn. I'm everywhere. So wherever you are, wherever you like to spend your time on the internet, search for Chris Gates Fitness. You're going to find me there, and you can send me a message any time of day, any day of the week. And if you have a really good question, we'll put it into the queue for an upcoming podcast episode. But with all that said, let's dive into the topic of the day, which of course is fasting worth it for fat loss? And to answer that question, it's probably a good place to start to just talk about what fasting actually is, because there's fasting and then there's intermittent fasting, okay? And those are actually two very different things. Fasting tends to be something that is a bit longer in duration. So we're talking about a day or more, okay? And you've probably been familiar with fasting just from potentially religious or spiritual practices that maybe you've done in the past, or people who have done that in the past. That type of fasting tends to be of the longer variety, whereas intermittent fasting is taking a period of time during each day where you have a window of time where it's called a feeding window, where you're allowed to eat food, and then a window of time where you're not allowed to eat food, which is called your fasting window. And there's a number of different ways that you can split that up. There's 16-8, which would be 16 hours of the day where you're not eating, and then 8 hours where you're allowed to. You could do 18-6, which is 18 hours of fasting. There's the OMAD diet, which I guess is maybe the most extreme form of intermittent fasting, which is one meal. So OMAD stands for one meal a day. You can slice it up however you want. I think the general understanding is that it needs to be at least 16 hours of fasting to be considered intermittent fasting. Intermittent fasting is also called time-restricted feeding. So if you ever hear somebody say that, they're talking about intermittent fasting. But it's just really, at the end of the day, a tool to help you get into a calorie deficit. If you're trying to lose body fat, as you've probably heard me say ad nauseum on this podcast before, you need to be in a calorie deficit to lose body fat. It's the only way it's going to happen, right? Because fat loss comes down to energy balance, and calories are a unit of energy. So if you are in a calorie deficit, meaning if you are eating fewer calories from food than your body burns on a daily basis, on a consistent basis, you will, over a long period of time, lose body fat. Okay, now intermittent fasting helps people do that because if you just set some guidelines for yourself that says like you're only allowed to eat for 8 hours a day or 6 hours a day or 5 hours a day, it makes it a lot easier to get into a calorie deficit because it's hard to overeat when you're only allowed to eat for a few hours a day, right? People have been led to believe that fasting is magic because it can have pretty impressive short-term results, but it's not magic. It's just a really effective tool for some people. And so people often turn to fasting because of that simplicity, right? You understand I can eat during these times and I can't eat during these times, and that's just how my days are going to operate. So for most people, it often involves just skipping breakfast. Because if you think about it, for a fasting window, let's say you eat dinner and maybe you're done eating by 7 p.m., 8 p.m. And then if the next day you wake up at 7 a.m., that's 12 hours of fasting right there. And if you eat a robust dinner, the fullness should take you until you go to bed, and then you're asleep and you're not thinking about food, right? So 12 hours right there is pretty easy. And then if you skip breakfast, you could get another 4, which helps you get to 16 hours of fasting. And then maybe around lunchtime, you can start eating from 11 or 12 until 7 or 8. And then that's your feeding window. Okay, that simplicity makes it easy for people to understand what to do. And this is also why a lot of fad diets are popular, because they tend to have simplicity, because they tend to have very rigid guidelines that can't be disputed, can't be argued, can't be customized. If you're doing the keto diet, but you're also eating carbs, then you're not doing the keto diet, right? People like the keto diet because it says you're just not going to eat any carbs. And if you're not going to eat any carbs and you remove an entire food group from your diet, makes it pretty easy to get into a calorie deficit because you don't have access to all of those types of food. Similar to the fasting and feeding windows, right? If you're only allowed to eat for a certain period of time, it makes it easy to get into a calorie deficit. There are promises of rapid weight loss with fasting, which is also why a lot of people turn to fasting. And that does tend to happen in the short term, is when you get into fasting and you only have a few hours to eat a day, you do tend to lose weight pretty quickly, which is, it's always nice to get early results. It can be problematic, and we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. That is a nice byproduct of it. Oftentimes people feel in control a bit more doing fasting because if you know when to eat, you know when not to eat. It just helps you wrap your arms around exactly how to manage your diet to lose body fat. And I think this works well for some people. What I have found through, again, 7+ years of coaching is that fasting for most people is effective in the short term. So most people can do intermittent fasting for a month or two and see pretty good results, okay? What I've also seen is that to maintain an intermittent fasting type of structure beyond that for the long term, a much smaller percentage of people are actually able to do that. Like 10% of people can probably maintain intermittent fasting for 3, 6, 9, 12 months or even longer. It's a small percentage of people. Most people at some point are, for a variety of reasons, going to get burnt out on those feeding and fasting windows and then want to go back to a more traditional diet. That just tends to be what happens, which leads to what the big problem with fasting actually is. And it's not that it doesn't work, because it absolutely can work. Like I said, it works for a lot of people in the short term, but most people don't want to fast forever. Okay, you have these feeding windows, you have these fasting windows, and I think a lot of the people here also listening to the podcast, You have a family, you have a career, you have hobbies, you have things that you want to do, places you want to go, people you want to spend time with. And so the longer that you're trying to refrain from eating, it's going to bleed over into life. It's going to bleed over into these social situations, and it's going to become unsustainable. Okay, so the big problem that happens is that we do fasting, we lose a bunch of body fat, and then we get to this point where it's like, I don't want to do this anymore. But you know what? I've made a lot of progress, so I'm just going to transition back to a more normal diet. And when you transition back to a more normal diet, then you lack the understanding of how to manage food and manage your relationship with the foods that you like to eat in a more traditional type of dieting schedule, right? So that leads to a lot of yo-yoing because people will lose weight on fasting. And then what they'll do is transition off of fasting whenever you've lost the 15, 20 pounds, however many pounds you want to lose, and then you start to gain it back. And then 6 months down the road, you're like, I need to lose weight again, so I'm going to do fasting again because that worked the last time. And so then you do fasting for a few months, you lose that same amount of weight again, transition back, and then you slowly regain that weight again because, once again, we're not addressing the root issue here. We're not addressing what actually leads you to gain weight in the first place. And so we get into this yo-yo cycle of losing weight, regaining it, starting over. And I often say to people with fasting, if somebody says, yeah, I'm going to do fasting, or fasting has worked for me in the past, I often try to gently or kindly say, if you have to lose weight again, did fasting really work for you? Can we really say that was an effective solution if you have to lose the same weight again? Because if we zoom out and think about what success is, what is something that works when we're talking about weight loss, losing body fat, dieting, ultimately the thing that works would be a solution that allows you to see progress and then maintain that progress long term. A solution that allows you to lose weight and then learn along the way how you lost weight, why you lost weight, manage your relationship and change your relationship and your habits with food, with fitness, so that you can manage those results long term. That to me is quote unquote, hey, it worked. And so people often don't get to that and they just get trapped in this yo-yoing cycle, which is really frustrating. So fasting tends to be more of a short-term fix for most people. It tends to not be a long-term solution. And again, like for the people listening here, for you and I, in our community of these parents who are ambitious about your fitness goals and you want to lose weight, you want to build muscle, you want to get in better shape, but you want to also be able to dominate in your career. You want to be able to be there for your kids and just have all the energy that you need to get through the day and do the things that you need to do. Fasting often doesn't align with all those responsibilities that you have. When you're eating in a way that's probably going to then be different than your family's schedule, that's odd, right? That's isolating. You can't eat breakfast with your family. You have to eat meals at different times than your family. I don't know that's ideal or even healthy for you or your family, because then what does that do for your kids? When your kids see that mom or dad is, they're not allowed to. Just that idea of a kid hearing mom or dad is not allowed to eat right now. What is that like? The long-term repercussions that could have on a child for their own relationship with health and fitness could be quite damaging, right? So as parents, we want to be able to model the right behavior. We also want to be able to partake and participate in everything that life has to offer and be there for our kids and be able to enjoy certain moments with our families. And so fasting in a lot of ways can remove you from being able to do that. It can lead to binging too. So something to think about is, depending on how hard the fasting window is for you and how long it may be, a lot of people can run into the issue of you have your fasting window, and then when your feeding window hits, when you're allowed to eat, then you're in the position of like, oh man, I am so ravenously hungry, I'm going to eat everything in sight, and it can snowball. And that's actually something that really messed with me when I did fasting. I have done fasting in the past. I have seen results with it, but I have also seen, maybe more often than the results, I've seen that it leads to me being so ravenously hungry that even though I'm tracking, even though I know the right things to do with my diet, my hunger signals get so loud that I struggle to stop eating. So it's something that I try to avoid doing. And so the binge eating piece to the puzzle is a very real factor as well. And it just, at the end of the day, I really think you shouldn't have to live differently than your family or than society to lose weight. You just shouldn't have to do it. And this goes back to what I've said a few times already on this episode, is that if you learn to do this by reshaping what your relationship looks like with the foods that you like to eat and really put in the time and effort to change habits, which takes longer. Admittedly, it takes longer, but my coaching philosophy is rooted in let's do this the way that is a bit slower, but a lot more sustainable. If you can really work on that, do the hard work. Might take a little bit longer now, but it's going to be something that lasts you for years, as opposed to in another 6 months having to do this whole entire process over again. You shouldn't have to live differently than your family to lose weight. You don't have to do that. And that's why I think fasting often doesn't work for parents. But what does work long-term, it tends to be what I just mentioned, the harder work, right? A more flexible approach tends to be a more sustainable approach. I really love flexible dieting because it allows you to just have a few parameters, a few goals that you need to hit with your diet. Most of my clients, we set a calorie window, right? So it's, hey, I want you to eat between 2,000 and 2,200 calories a day to be in a calorie deficit. Something, obviously that's a generic number, but we'll set some type of parameters around the amount of calories to eat. And then often we're focused on protein too. Sometimes the other macronutrients, sometimes fiber, but really calories and protein. If you could build a diet that you're able to hit the right amounts with your calories, the right protein, and be consistent with that, it allows you to not have to eliminate any of your favorite foods. It allows you to not have to remove yourself from meals or situations with your family or friends that you want to be able to participate in. It's just more sustainable. It's more enjoyable. No foods are off limits. No times are off limits. And then it allows you to build those habits that are going to sustain you longer than just 6 or 7 or 8 weeks, which is obviously nice, right? You want to put in the work. If you're going to do the hard work, might as well have it last for years as opposed to weeks. At the end of the day, what was the question? What was the overall topic here? Is fasting worth it for fat loss? If I had to give you an answer, I would say no. I don't think fasting is worth it for fat loss. I think it is a short-term solution. It's not a long-term fix. And I think most people benefit most from having a long-term fix. Taking a little bit longer to do it the right way with a flexible approach is going to set you up for years of success as opposed to just months. It can work for you short term, but I don't think most people want just a few months of results. You want a few years. You want a few decades. So I would suggest if you're thinking about doing some type of fasting protocol, maybe don't. Maybe don't, I guess is my recommendation. But what do you think? If this was helpful, let me know. If you disagree, would love to hear why. Always open to hearing other people's thoughts and feedback. But hope this episode was helpful. Thank you so much for listening and watching. And I'm excited to check in with you next week with another brand new episode. So until then, have a great day, and I will talk to you soon.